Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Paul Harris and I'm president of the City Club's Board of Directors. I am pleased to introduce today's speaker, former chairman of the United States Committee on Ways and Means, and current senior policy advisor in PricewaterhouseCoopers, or PwC's, Washington National Tax Services practice, Dave Kemp. Now, it would certainly be an understatement to say that this has been a dynamic and unpredictable general election season. And as today's early plunge of the Dow Jones Industrial Average illustrates, the so-called Brexit outcome has introduced even more dynamism and unpredictability into the equation. What better time for our presenter to appear at the City Club of Cleveland to offer his unique insights into the presidential election process, the candidates, the political outlook for 2016, tax reform, and other interesting subjects. Now, we do anticipate a lively question and answer session following Mr. Kemp's remarks, so please keep that in mind. Mr. Kemp joined PwC in 2015 after serving as a member of the United States House of Representatives for nearly 25 years. From 2010 to 2014, he served as chairman of the Committee on Ways and Means, the oldest committee of the United States Congress, and the Chief Tax Writing Committee of the House of Representatives. The roster of committee members who have gone on to serve in higher office is an impressive statistic. 8 presidents and 8 vice presidents have served on Ways and Means, as have 21 speakers of the House of Representatives and 4 justices of the United States Supreme Court. So you fall somewhere in that equation, right? So, as Ways and Means Chairman, Mr. Kemp was recognized not only for serving as part of House Republican leadership, but also for his significant leadership in advancing comprehensive tax reform. He played a major role in the formation of policy on a wide range of issues and was engaged in the committee's work on tax policy, international trade, Medicare, Social Security, and fiscal policy issues for more than 2 decades. In March of 2014, he introduced H.R. 1, the Tax Reform Act of 2014. The Kemp proposal, as it became known, is widely recognized as foundational text for future business and international tax reform. A native of Michigan, Mr. Kemp received his undergraduate degree from Albion College and his law degree from the University of San Diego School of Law. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Dave Kemp.
Paul, very much. Gosh, thank you. Well, thank you, Paul, very much, and thank you for the invitation to be at the City Club of Cleveland, America's citadel of free speech. And I have to say, Cleveland's known now for something else. You're now the City of Champions, and congratulations. Yeah. Congratulations to the Cavaliers. You know, often I was thinking sports is a metaphor for life. And one of the things you have to do in sports and in life is never give up. And even when you're down, you can't give up. And it also is really a testament to the power of a dream. And so it is with a passion of mine, which is tax reform. And I know we'll have an opportunity to talk about some other things than that in the Q&A period, but I wanted to talk a little bit about that, which is certainly an area where we can't give up. Hopefully it won't take 52 years to get tax reform, but it really is a dream of mine and a passion of mine. We do need to reform our outdated, broken tax system. And I know that tax policy would be something my friends from PwC are interested in hearing about, but as I said, we can talk about some other things in the Q&A period. But I was appointed to the Committee on Ways and Means early in my career, and as Paul said in his introduction, it's a committee that deals with Social Security, welfare, Medicare, and also tax policy. So it's a committee that has a lot of jurisdiction and authority. And one of the things that happened to me is I was able to get a leadership role on the committee in 2009, and then lightning struck in 2010, and we'd been in the minority, and we took the majority, and lo and behold, then I was elected chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. And it was really an exciting time. And I'll never forget sort of the incredulous look on the face of friends of mine and family members when I became chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. They'd look at me and they'd say, "You?" And I'd say, "Only in America." But one of the first meetings I had in the fall of 2010 was with my counterpart in the Senate, who was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee at that time, Senator Max Baucus, a Democrat from Montana, and then also at that time the Secretary of the Treasury, Tim Geithner, and then the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Jack Lew, who then went on to become Secretary of the Treasury. And we were dealing with something that we in Washington call extenders, or temporary tax policy. And there were over 100 provisions in the tax code that were going to expire. And this meeting was, what are we going to do about them? The problem is, we are the only nation in the world that lets huge parts of its tax policy expire. Sometimes we let it expire for a year. Then we retroactively go back in, put it in place, sometimes forward for a year, sometimes forward only for a week or two. And it is really makes it obviously extremely difficult for employers, businesses, and families to plan, because you don't know what the law is going to be. You can say, oh, well, they've extended it before, they're going to do it again, but you never really know. So I knew in that meeting that was something I wanted to do something about, this whole idea that we have temporary tax policy. So that was one of the motivating things for me in doing something about tax policy. The other one was in 2010, we were still in a recession. We were not recovering. Some would say we still haven't gone as far as we want to. But obviously being from Michigan, we felt the recession much deeper than maybe Ohio. Maybe that's one place we actually beat Ohio in that we didn't want to. But we lost between 2000 and 2009, 800,000 jobs in one state. So it was, I knew the recovery was not what it needed to be or what it should be, and wanted to do something about that. And I knew that tax policy was one way. There's clearly a whole list of things that we need to do as a country, but I thought tax policy was something I had an ability to try to do something about. And we have seen our unemployment rate improve. There aren't as many, but a large part of that is because people have left the workforce. And if you actually take the number they're giving you and double it, that's more likely what the sort of real unemployment rate is. The other problem we've had and had in 2010 is that median incomes, sort of the median wage or amount of income people have, which is about $52,000 a year, has been stagnant since 2008. It actually went down a little bit and kind of came back to where it was. So it has not improved in almost a decade. And so I knew we had a problem there. And we haven't seen sort of the general economy improve. This may be the first administration without any quarter of GDP growth at 3%. And the problem with that is if GDP is under 3%, the economy is not able to absorb those trying to enter the workforce. So all the kids that are graduating from college and want to go on and work or maturing and deciding to enter the workforce, the economy isn't at a stage where we can sustain sort of the new entrance into the economy. I thought that was something we needed to do something out. And so I felt like tax reform was a way to sort of increase jobs, grow the economy, increase people's take-home pay, make life better for families, and also ultimately in 2010, revenues to the government had plummeted. And I thought this is a way of creating more revenue without raising taxes through people having more work, obviously getting more income, they're paying more taxes. So it was a way of resolving some of the things that had been unresolved, whether it was the Simpson-Bowles Commission or the Super Committee or the Boehner-Obama talks. Nothing was really sort of resolving that issue, and I thought that was one way that we could do it. And when you look at sort of the longer-term fiscal picture, the budget we actually vote on in Congress, or I used to vote on in Congress, is only 30% of the budget. 70% of the budget is on what we call automatic pilot. Those are mandatory spending, those are entitlements. And so in order to really try to right this whole long-term fiscal outlook, you really need to do something about that. And the other issue is, so I thought the economy needed to grow to help take care of this problem. The other concern is that if you look at the long-term projection, in about 30 years, which isn't that long, I know that seems long when you're under 30, it's not as long when you're over 30. But in about 30 years, our entitlements, if you will, or mandatory spending, whatever word you want to describe, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the payments in the Affordable Care Act, interest on the debt, that will be all spending. So that means the spending, the 30% we vote on, defense, medical research at NIH, national parks, there will be no room for those in that equation. And so I knew that I felt like we wanted to do something. And we've been at historically low interest rates. And right now, interest on the debt's about 6% of the budget. If those just tick up a little bit, that number goes way up. And then that makes that pressure even greater. And then in addition to this idea of extenders and the fact that the economy wasn't recovering like it should, I saw that we were consistently out of step with the rest of the world in terms of our tax policy. We actually have the highest statutory rate in corporate business statutory rate in the world at 35%. And we're the second highest effective tax rate on business, except for France. And so we're really not in line with where the rest of the world has come. The other thing is we are the only major economy in the world left that taxes income, so our international tax laws, taxes income a second time when it's brought back from overseas. It's called a worldwide system of taxation. You may hear policymakers talk about that. We're virtually the only economy that does that, that's of any size. And others used to, but they changed. We haven't changed. And as a result of that, because there's this double tax, our U.S. companies that do business around the world are not bringing the dollars they earn overseas back and investing it here. It's what we call stranded overseas, and they estimate that number could be well over $2 trillion. I think the last number I saw was 2.3 trillion with a T. We are at historically low levels of investment here in the United States. And if we could get those dollars brought back on a regular basis, those dollars could be invested here. And the problem is, when money's sitting overseas, it doesn't just sit there. It gets invested there. So that means the growth and innovation and new opportunities are going to be there, not here. And I wanted to see that happening here. The other point that's happening internationally is other countries are dramatically reforming their tax codes. If you look at the United Kingdom, they're in the news, certainly. They're at 20% rate, and they're going to be moving to 18%. You look at our neighbor to the north, Canada, and I'm from Michigan. I can see Canada from my backyard. Not really. In 2000, their corporate tax rate was 43%. Now it's 26%. And Ireland has probably gone further than a lot of countries we know. They're at 12.5%. So we have a lot of concern there. There's also a lot of pressure from around the world, from the other nations. And part of the reason they view these dollars that are stranded overseas as somewhat stateless income, that is just up there for the taking. And we in the U.S. view that as tax deferred, because these are U.S. companies that have decided not to bring these dollars back. So the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, called the OECD, has been engaged for several years on this project on base erosion, which means profits being transferred around the world and going to the lowest tax jurisdiction, and really examining that carefully. And that is actually putting more pressure on U.S. companies as well. There are about 34 countries in the OECD. The U.S. is a member of those. It is really highlighted and really brought uncertainty to the international tax arena, which has actually been pretty well settled for a number of years. And I think that's probably the biggest concern there. The other thing is the European Union. They have been engaged in what's called a state aid investigation. What have their member countries given to companies to locate jobs in their countries? If you ever saw this LuxLeaks report about particularly Belgium, what they and Luxembourg, what they did in those two countries to bring sort of corporate headquarters there and jobs that follow. I think the result of both of those initially will be a lot more disclosure, and I think that may not necessarily all be a bad thing, but there's going to be some country by country reporting, and all of that and the EU would like to make that public. That's just brought a lot of uncertainty, what will be reported, how it will be reported, and I think that is something that we need to understand, that this has an impact potentially on not just U.S. companies, but the employees and families that work for those companies. And so the fact that we are really in a different place in terms of our policy than the rest of the world means we need to really do something there. And as a result, you've got companies that are moving their headquarters overseas for tax purposes. And in the parlance, it's called redomiciling. They'll find a way to have their headquarters in another country. And in the last decade, there have been about 50 that have done that. But in the previous 2 decades, it was less than 30. So this is a trend that has increased, that is really a big concern. If you look at 1960, 17 of the top companies in the world were US-based. In 2015, 6 of the top 20 companies in the world were based in the US. Now, when I started working on tax reform, everyone said, oh, it hasn't been done since the Reagan era, it's been 30 plus years. The problem with our international tax laws, that's since the 1960s. So it's been, the Reagan reform did not address international tax policy. So we're just way behind. And then in addition to these things I've mentioned, the complexity of our tax code has grown tremendously. Since 1986, the tax code's almost tripled in size. So from the Reagan era reform, it's almost 3 times as big. And I'm not counting the regulations that go along with that. And in the last decade alone, there have been more than 1 change a day. So it's very hard to keep track of what's happening. They estimated, I think it was the National Taxpayer Advocate, said that in 2016, it took Americans 8.9 billion hours to comply with the tax code. That's a lot of time that you could be doing something else. And the lost productivity with that. The cost, more than $400 billion to comply. 90% of us hire someone. I mean, obviously I'm at PwC, that's something that, but is that really the thing that we should be doing? Or buy computer software? 9 out of 10 small businesses. When I worked on this, we actually had a lot of testimony, heard from a lot of small businesses, and many of them did not know what they signed, and the cost of compliance was pretty high for them. And I think that's a real concern. And the problem is, I think what a lot of people are afraid of is there might be a mistake. And then, of course, that letter from the IRS always comes as you get home Friday night and open the mail, and there's nothing you can do until Monday morning. But the problem is, if we make a mistake, the problem is really on us. But if you look at over the last decade, the IRS sent $132 billion of your tax dollars to false claimants. So they don't always do it right themselves. And I think the problem with this complexity is that there really is this sense of unfairness. You always sort of have this sense, well, the other guy's getting a better deal. Because somehow they're connected, or they're doing the things that the government's rewarding, or they have better counsel or better tax advisors than I do. And so I think for a voluntary tax system to have this sense that if only you were an insider, you'd figure this out, is really not the way to go. So I think simplifying our code is clearly something we need to do. So I spent 4 years working on a bill, a comprehensive bill, and I introduced it, as Paul said, in March of 2014. And I was very interested that it be bipartisan, that the process be transparent. As I said, 30 hearings. I created working groups with the Democrats and Republicans together, worked with my counterpart in the Senate. We had the first hearing on tax policy between the House and the Senate in 70 years. I thought it was very important that we try to reach out and do that. So what I did is cut the size of the code by 25%, took the 6 rates down to 2 for 99% of taxpayers, and the top rate was 25%. The standard deduction was increased so that 95% of people would not itemize. So that means you got to file a simple form. That means you didn't have to keep a shoebox full of papers and invoices. And it was the real thing that I worked on was this thing called dynamic scoring. I don't mean to make everybody's eyes glaze over, but in tax policy, it's all about what will this do to the budget and to the economy. And in Congress, they'd always used what's called a static score, which assumed that tax policy wouldn't affect the economy. I always call that like using high school physics, where you say, assume there's no gravity. Well, we go out in the real world and there is gravity. So dynamic scoring is about having a real-world analysis of what tax policy will do. So this bill, H.R. 1, that the committee and I worked on, was the first tax bill to ever be scored dynamically. And it was good in the sense that it showed that the bill would create, if we changed policies in this way, would create 2 million jobs, would increase median income by $1,300 a year, would grow GDP by 20%, and would increase revenue to the government by almost $700 billion. And if you didn't want to do that, you could take that and change. Also modernized our international tax system in the course of that. So I think, but unfortunately it was not something our leadership was ready to do. So it didn't really go anywhere. So you fast forward to 2015. Paul Ryan becomes chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, who worked with me on H.R. 1. He wants to do comprehensive reform. The president says right off the bat, I will veto any bill that lowers the individual rate. And the problem there is much of the business activity in the U.S. now is done in what we call pass-through. So they pay individual rates. So if you can't lower the individual rate, you're not doing anything with all those businesses that are pass-through entities. So what then they tried to do was to do something on sort of international reform. And Paul spent a lot of the year working on that, was not able to ultimately put something together. But in the end, at 2015, they did make permanent a number of these extenders that I'm talking about, particularly one called the Research and Development Tax Credit, which is very important for innovation and investment. So they did make some progress, and I really look at that as a down payment on tax reform. So then you come into 2016, we had this sort of tumultuous change in leadership. Paul Ryan, becomes at the end of 15 the Speaker of the House, new chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Kevin Brady from Texas. And Paul Ryan says this: we are not going to be the opposition party, we're going to be the proposition party. I'm creating these task forces, I want one of them to be on tax policy, and we're going to tell the country where we stand. And just by coincidence, the tax reform tax policy report was made public today. So what he wants to do is not only have this for re-election, but he wants to try to drive the debate for the candidates for president, and also whoever the next president is, present them with this. This is where the House of Representatives is on these issues. It's been interesting that a number of the presidential candidates on the Republican side have had sort of comprehensive reform plans, but we're really down to two now in terms of Republican and Democrat. And Donald Trump has said he wants to have tax reform that makes America great again. And he has a 15% tax on business, a 25% tax on individuals. It's really more of a Reagan-style, lower rates, broaden the base type of reform. Hillary Clinton has said, we want to reform our tax code so that the wealthiest pay their fair share. She doesn't have necessarily a comprehensive reform bill, but she has a fair share tax at those earning over $5 million, a tax, a flat or a minimum tax on those at $1 million and above. Both candidates want to tax carried interest as ordinary income. She also wants to lengthen how long you hold an asset before you can get capital gains. The House blueprint, which was released today, is under this Paul Ryan Better Way agenda. And under that, they propose a 20% tax on business. So you can see this number is following the international community and going down. A high tax of about 33% on individuals. Now this blueprint goes a different direction than I did in H.R. 1, and they are going to use full expensing, which is actually saying we want to emphasize economic growth. It's not something Donald Trump is doing. It's something that Jeb Bush had in his plan. And they are not going to be taxing the emphasis is not going to be on income taxes. It's really more of a consumption tax, which is more like sort of a Ted Cruz approach. There will be no deductibility for interest. So it does lower rates, it does broaden the base to some extent, but it really is, this blueprint this morning is really going to be about how do we maximize economic growth. And also there is a reform of the IRS involved in this proposal. Now mine was legislative language with every I dotted and T crossed. This is more of a narrative, it is a blueprint. It's not detailed in nature, but they want to have sort of a small claims division of the IRS so that you have a problem, you can resolve your problem quickly and easily, and I think this sort of goes to some of the problems we've had. The Senate is going a different way in terms of what they call corporate integration. Senator Hatch is proposing that, which is really saying that dividends should be taxed at the recipient level. And that is saying that that income should only be taxed once. You've also got the ranking member, Senator Wyden, a Democrat from Oregon, who's tried to sort of simplify depreciation rules. He's done some things on reform on derivatives. But the important point I want to make on all this is there is a lot of activity on tax policy, both among policymakers and among the candidates. And I think this is a significant thing. A Gallup poll has for weeks, and just came out again in June, says that Americans believe that the economy and jobs are the number one issue facing us. And 66% of Americans have been polled and say the country's on the wrong track. But what's new, and that has trended negatively for some time, but what's new about that number is they don't think things are going to get better. And that is a very different sort of outlook for Americans. And I think these are issues that have been driving certainly the debate in the campaign. And as I said, flat incomes, flat median incomes, and Americans are angry. And they're angry, I think, a large sense because of this lack of upward mobility, or that this sense that things are going to get better. I was at an economics forum, and an economist who used to be head of the CBO, Doug Holtz-Eakin, said, from World War II to 2008, our standard of living doubled every 38 years. Since 2008, they're estimating it will take 60 years for our standard of living to double. So literally, I could work my working life before 2008 and see my standard of living and the standard of living of my children get better. And since 2008, you're going to look at that and say, I will work my whole working life and I won't see that significant rise in standard of living. The parties are talking about this in different ways. Republicans talk about it in terms of economic growth and jobs. Democrats tend to talk about it in terms of fairness and equality. I think it's really two sides of the same coin. I think they're really getting at this issue that I talked about. And it really is, is the American dream there for them? Is the American dream there for their families? And the sense that no matter how hard you work, you're going to be treading water, I think is really feeding into this. And I think to some extent you're seeing this around the world as well with the Brexit vote. Just on conclusion, I'm actually somewhat optimistic because they are actually working, the wheels of the legislative process are grinding away to try to get this thing done. I do think, there are a lot of proposals in Congress. There's a lot of talk in the campaign. I think we are going to need a president, whoever that is, to have this be sort of one of their top 2 or 3 issues. Every president since Ronald Reagan has had a tax bill of some kind in their first year. And I think the next president, whoever that is going to have something. It may not be a comprehensive bill, but they're going to have something to do. Hillary Clinton just mentioned that she is going to release a middle-class tax cut, so I think she's going to be moving in that area as well. We'll have to just watch and see. I don't want to leave with an unrealistic, optimistic prediction. I do think we have some problems in that the competition for control in the Congress and in the government, particularly in the Senate, is something that's going to make a path forward on something as important as a comprehensive tax reform bill more difficult. In 2014, you had the Senate go from Democrat to Republican, and you've got in 2016, you've got more than twice as many Republicans up than Democrats, and 7 of them are in states that President Obama won. So here you've got this majority that may be in play. The concern is in 2018, it goes the other way. You have 25 Democrats up and only 8 Republicans, so 3 times as many Democrats up in 2018, and of those, 5 of those are in states that Mitt Romney won. So you're literally going to have potentially this leadership from 14 to 16 to 18 that could go back and forth. That makes it harder to sort of get consensus on a long-term project like reforming our tax code, which I think is key to getting our economy moving in and getting jobs again. So I think it's something that we need to all weigh in on. This is something we need to demand of our candidates, that they have a plan, that we get past just personalities, that we really try to push these issues forward. Because I think if we do, I think we have an opportunity to really get us back on track. I mean, in terms of growth, we're doing better than what we see in certainly in Europe and other parts of the world, but it's not good enough for us. And we need to make sure that we modernize our tax code, that we really move into the 21st century and have a tax code that really works for Americans, for their families, and does everything we can to really get this economy sort of humming again, so that we have those people who are sitting on the sidelines come back into the workforce, and that we can employ those young people that are getting started. I just really want to thank you for the time today, and I look forward to answering your questions, or at least having a good dialogue. Thank you very much. Thanks. Thank you, Paul.
You can have a seat.
Okay.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we are enjoying a Friday forum with Dave Kemp, former chairman of the United States Committee on Ways and Means and current senior policy advisor in PwC's Washington National Tax Services practice. We're headed now to our question and answer period, and we welcome questions from everyone here, City Club members, guests, students, or those of you joining us via our webcast. If you'd like to tweet a question, you can do so at the City Club, and our staff will try to work your question into the program. We want to respectfully request that you keep your questions short, to the point, and actually structured as questions. Holding the microphones today are City Club Marketing and Outreach Fellow Faye Walker. Where's Faye? There she is. And City Club Director of Programming Stephanie Jansky. First question, please.
Thanks.
Congressman, thank you very much for your distinguished service.
Oh, thank you.
You have made deep reference when you talk about the Boyle-Simpson Commission before.
Yes.
And your comment about the more and more of the mandatory spending is taking over to the point where we have less and less discretionary funding. Please give me and the rest of a little bit of a history lesson. The Boyle-Simpson Commission report was about as bipartisan or as fair as you could get, as far as each side got something, each side gave something, and could give up something. Why, as we see this trend, as you talked about and brought up, why does the Boyle-Simpson Commission report, or some example of that, why is that not being so successful? Why is that not being implemented? Why don't both sides, when they face what you said, come to the realization this is our answer?
Yes, I mean, that presidential commission, the Boyle-Simpson Commission, has not really been accepted by the president. And secondly, on the other side, and one of the problems I had with it, there were many good things in there, but ultimately they assumed a level of revenue that was much higher than the 40-year average since post-World War II. So not only did the report have a number of reforms, but it also was a major growth in the size of government. I was on that commission, and I made my views to both of them very clear, to Erskine Bowles and to Senator Simpson, and that's why you saw at least, and there were some Republican senators who did vote for it, but I think that's why you saw it wasn't universally accepted on the Republican side, but it wasn't universally accepted on the Democrat side either. And I think primarily it was the president's commission, and he didn't really acknowledge their findings.
Hi, I was fascinated by what you said about the Senate being in play this year and again in 2 years, and the idea that it could change a number of times in the near future. I think it wouldn't matter that much if the two sides were able to talk to each other. And as a member of Congress for many years, what needs to happen so that the Democrats and the Republicans start talking to each other again and working together, which they don't seem to be doing right now?
No, and I think part of the problem is this competition for who's in charge. I hate to make predictions, but I think, especially in this year, but I do think the House probably stays in the Republican majority. That gives at least some sort of stability to what issues are being driven. I mean, it's taken them almost 2 years to release this blueprint on tax reform. It took me 3 years to put forward that legislative proposal. And I think what you get is different approaches. They are talking more on tax policy than in some other areas, kind of under the radar. But you're right. I mean, it is a very it's a very competitive political environment, and that does make it difficult. I think there's a number of reasons for that. I saw it change over the 25 years I was there, but we do need to find a way to come together on some of these issues. I think kind of some of these task forces do help. I know in the Senate, Senator Hatch had one on tax policy, on international tax policy, and you actually had Senator Schumer from New York and Senator Portman, who's right from Ohio, both kind of agree on a path forward on international. They're both, Senator Schumer is going to be leader of the Democrats next year and potentially leader of the entire Senate. Senator Portman has a tremendous reputation on policy, particularly tax policy. So you've got some sort of grassroots, grass shoots of things coming up. I do think we need, on an issue like this that isn't as partisan as some of the others, that if we could sort of have a greater involvement from the chief executive. I do think we need a president who wants tax reform as one of their top issues. And I think it's necessary. And if we have that, I mean, you can only drive so much of this legislative process. And our founders wanted power to be diffused, and they were very good at it. There's no one party or no one person that runs the tables in our government, no matter who's where. And so it really is going to sort of take a commitment that we really have to do this and find a way to move forward. It's not easy, but it's disappointing. I think this is part of the anger you see in the electorate. They don't feel like Washington's responding to their needs. How is Washington making their lives better? And also one thing a president can do is help explain with a very large microphone how these reforms might make your life better. It's very hard for even the Speaker of the House, who is well known and has a very articulate, even he has trouble breaking through compared to what a President of the United States can do.
Thanks for coming. Republicans have been talking about, including Senator Portman, about tax cuts, but very few have been talking about revenues impact. And Trump, estimates, or it's estimated that with his tax cuts there'll be a $10 trillion deficit. Shouldn't we be focusing on the revenue side?
Yes, and 10 trillion, that's just not going to happen. But I do think some of the concepts in there of a lower rate, a broader base, trying to find a way to grow our economy. The bill I worked on was what we call revenue neutral, from a static basis. And then what you're really seeing on the blueprint that was released today is revenue neutral on a dynamic basis, so that they will find a way to get policies that grow the economy that allow them then to bring down rates, if that makes any sense. And that I think is going to be important. I mean, you've got sort of Republicans, at least in the debate, in the primary process, had proposals that lost lots of revenue, and you had Democrat proposals that raised lots of revenue. And I don't think either one of those is going to be where the country's going to go. But I think if you can dynamically grow the economy, and as a result of that growth and people having jobs and being paid, revenue to the government increases, that would give you sort of some flexibility, I think, in lowering rates. I mean, particularly on the business side, and I think on the individual side, I'm not sure that the government should have more than a third of what you earn. But on the business side, we are so out of step with the rest of the world, we're losing what we call these headquarters jobs. Now look, I come from a little town with a big company. From Midland, Michigan. It's the home of Dow Chemical. Herbert Dow actually grew up in Cleveland, went to Case Western Reserve, and the early financing for Dow was from Cleveland. But whenever we need to raise money for the hospital or the United Way, we go to executives who work at that company, and they usually chair the campaign and they contribute money to the campaign. So if you're talking about building the fabrics of our community and strengthening the fabrics of our community, we lose these headquarters jobs, all of the jobs that go with it, not to mention suppliers and other things, I think. So it's not just about the top jobs, but the top jobs are important. So that's why I think we have to do something that involves a lower rate on the business side, because that's where the world is going. And we're an outlier, and we just can't be alone in that concept anymore. But so there is flexibility to do that. And for example, just recently, the Joint Committee on Taxation, which is the nonpartisan scorekeeper of what tax policy does, lowered their estimate of corporate revenue because companies are moving overseas. So we do need to address this, and I think that's one way to do it.
Thank you for
Yes.
coming. I was up late last night. I watched both Fox News and had 2 links to The Guardian on my computer. And it was very interesting. Basically, The Guardian said that Britain votes for Trump with the way that the English are mad at, the way that the English are mad at Brussels and we're mad at Washington. What outcome do you think the Brexit vote will have on the American elections? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking before, and I said, you know, it's interesting because the polls were wrong on that, but not only were the pollsters wrong, the bookies were wrong. I mean, so, you know, I think what you have with Brexit is you had sort of the government, the political establishment, and the business leaders all saying vote to remain, and yet the public, in a pretty, it wasn't that close, voted to exit. So. And even the leaders of the 5 largest parties in Britain all said remain. So there's this disconnect. I think the similarity might be this disconnect sort of between the establishment types and there as well as here. And whether, you know, like there's a lot of people who are going to be looking at this and analyzing this, but I do think the pace of change, globalization, the sense that there's this economic and to some extent, you know, cultural insecurity. I think those are all things that sort of play into this, but it's this sense that, I mean, we're seeing really an anti-establishment sort of effort here in the, you know, sort of trend in the United States, whether it's media or whether it's business or whether it's political leaders. And I don't, you know, I wasn't there for all the debate, and, you know, we get such a filter on that coming here. I don't know if that all applies to the British. I sort of think that is happening here. But I think, and as we know, some of this pace of change is technology, and some of it is globalization, and when we don't have institutions responding to that, I do think a lot of people are concerned. And again, the English have done better than the rest of Europe economically in their economy. I don't know that that goes to all parts of Britain necessarily. Certainly in the London area, they've done better. But I don't know that it is directly, there's a direct analogy there, but clearly they did not do what the establishment in Britain was asking them to do. They went the other way. And this is an anti-establishment year, and I think you saw it with the rise of Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders and I were elected at the same time. He was in my quote class when I got to the House, and some of his friends in the Senate are scratching their heads and thinking, if it was him, why not me, you know? Because he was not the most likely choice of people who are going to go on the rise, but he really has tapped into that as Donald Trump has. And again, all of the experts said Donald Trump wasn't going to get as far as he has. And so I think this is just a year that the normal predictions and what a lot of political sort of pundits like to do is say, well, in 5 elections, this happened, so that will happen now. I don't think this is one of those. This is a one-off in a sense. There's new ground being broken on sort of the political analysis.
Congressman, it's good to listen to you. You mentioned in your prepared remarks that we would have increased revenue by broadening the base.
Yeah.
Mitt Romney said that 47% of the tax-paying population pays no federal income tax. However, of that 47%, pretty much everybody pays Social Security taxes. Mm-hmm. In your proposals, has there been an attempt to balance the amount paid by the lower end of the socioeconomic scale in their Social Security taxes against the tax rates in coming up with the revenue projections?
Yeah, I put a couple of very severe restrictions on the plan that I worked on, and the reason I did that is I consulted with former Treasury Secretary James Baker III, who was there when the 86 Act went through, and then also Democrat leader of the House, Dick Gephardt, and they both advised me, you want to be statically revenue neutral. And when I was working on that, we had just come off the Romney campaign, which was you cut taxes for the rich and raise taxes on the poor. So I was distributionally neutral. I left the amount of tax that each quintile of income paid the same. So roughly no group saw their, sort of as a group, their revenue contribution go up or down. So it was really a Rubik's Cube of analysis. But I thought it was important because I didn't want people to dismiss this idea right off the bat and say, oh, look, he's just doing that. And what I wanted to get is a review that it was a serious proposal. We did get that. And so I think it has helped advance the cause. Now, this proposal that came out today, we don't know enough to be able to answer your question on that, what they're doing on that. They are going to 3 rates, as I said, 33, 25, and I think 12. I don't know the breakdown of how all this will mean, but in the bill, H.R. 1, which was a detailed legislative proposal, I can tell you that every quintiles group of contributions stayed the same. And as you pointed out, when people say they don't pay income tax, they do pay what we call payroll tax. So there is a tax burden there that often doesn't get recognized in the political debate and rhetoric there that we need to make sure we acknowledge. My purpose was, I want more people paying payroll taxes because I want more people working. And that was the goal of mine. This proposal today on this better way forward or better way ahead is better way is really driving growth. That's what they did. I mean, I actually sort of slowed cost recovery in H.R. 1. They have gone to what we call full expensing, and that is going to really drive that. So that's sort of the difference in those two there.
Hi, you talked a lot about tax reform, but there are a variety of other issues facing the country as we speak, the most relevant being gun control, as we saw. What is your perspective on the bills proposed this week and rejected, and how do you think we can move forward in an effort to enhance our gun control and the safety?
Yeah, and as I said earlier, there's lots of ways to improve our country, but I was on a committee that dealt with tax policy, and I was not on a committee that dealt with those issues in a detailed way. And so these remarks today were really focused on that. I'm not in the arena anymore, but clearly, there is, it's an issue that we've not really been able to find a consensus on. I do think, though, this idea of this no-fly list doesn't necessarily mean you're a terrorist. And they do need to find some way of working through, not necessarily in the gun context, but how do you get on that list? How do you get off that list? And I think it's not as well vetted as it probably should be. As you know, former Senator Ted Kennedy was on the no-fly list. A number of sort of famous people have been on it that had no business being on it. So I think to simply, deny their constitutional rights, and the Supreme Court has said, the right to bear arms is a fundamental constitutional right. So I think there is a way forward on that. I don't know that we're in a place where it's being treated as serious. I mean, unfortunately, we're in high campaign season right now, and I know that some are very genuinely motivated on this issue. Others are not, and I think it's important that that particularly on something as sensitive as this and as divisive as this, that I'm not sure in the midst of a presidential and congressional campaigns that you're going to get the most even-handed debate from either side. Yes.
Thank you for coming. The two major party candidates have moved away from a commitment which had been a bipartisan commitment for about a couple of decades to free trade.
Yeah.
So we have, for example, Hillary Clinton reversing herself, and now she's against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and of course Donald Trump is against it. In the event, what do you see as the prospects for free trade and trade agreements in the wake of the 2016 election?
Yeah, you have both presidential candidates now who are opposed to the TPP proposal, which is a trade agreement with Southeast Asian nations. And I was obviously very involved in trade issues. It's one of the issues that's in the Ways and Means Committee. And I was very proud of the fact that we passed the Panama, Colombia, and Korean trade agreements while I was there, and I worked very closely with the administration to do that. But all of those votes were bipartisan. There were pretty big numbers of Democrats that came along. It wasn't just a Republican thing. I think the issue is there, who's going to set the rules? Is China going to set the rules, or is the United States going to set the rules? And if we can create a trading bloc that is a counterweight to China, I mean, I was just reading about, the opening of Shanghai Disney. Disney only owns 43% of that because the Chinese require that they are the majority owner. I mean, the rules that we put up with to do business there, I don't get it. So if you have alternatives to that, I think that brings them more into sort of the family of nations in terms of what is legitimate. So that's something I actually agree with President Obama on. I think it is part of what he wanted to have as a pivot to Asia in the sense of that. I think that we need to continue to work on that. There are some areas that I think need attention within that agreement, and as was the case with the Korean agreement, it wasn't perfect when it came back, and I worked very hard, and it was actually bipartisan with my partner that was Sandy Levin on the Ways and Means Committee, who was the ranking member. We worked very hard to get the administration to get some changes. They're probably going to have to do that with TPP before it comes to Congress. It's not going to come before a lame duck session. I don't know with both presidential candidates opposed to it if that's something that would happen in a lame duck, because either one who wins, they may say, President Obama, do it on your watch, or they may say, don't do it on your watch. We just don't know. I mean, there's just too much uncertainty here, but I think it is something that we need to ultimately do, because it really does allow us to have some leverage on the Chinese, and also bring some stability. And they frankly don't really want us to have these relationships with some of their competitors, and I think we need to.
In terms of comprehensive immigration reform, we would have maybe 10 or 11 million people being able to pay taxes at that time. Do you see that making a significant impact on the budget or additional revenues?
Yeah, and also we've now got the Supreme Court decision just the other day, which, I think we're going to have to see how this sort of filters out and what this actually might mean. The court basically invalidated the administration's approach to immigration. Again, this is an issue that I think is certainly now in the full throes of the presidential campaign, and we have not been able to find a way to resolve this for a number of years. I was, when Homeland Security was initially created, I was the chairman of the Border and Infrastructure Subcommittee, and we just have very different approaches to the northern border than we do to the southern border. And after 9/11, I do think we need to know who comes in and who leaves in a way that we aren't doing now. That doesn't really address your issue. But I think the fact that we aren't doing that makes it harder for us to resolve those who are here. And I think if we could get some border certainty, that would be very helpful on that.
Thank you for coming, Congressman. You seem to believe, and I agree, that tax policy does affect jobs and the economy. Is there a partisan divide on this issue? And if so, does that impede reform, and how do we resolve that?
I don't think there is a partisan divide on that, because the nonpartisan, for budget issue, it's the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, we've all heard of them. But for tax policy, it's the Joint Committee on Taxation, and what they say goes. And the current head of that has been appointed by Republicans and Democrats, and he's very well respected. And it doesn't mean I always agree with their analysis, and neither does the other side, but I think at least this idea of dynamic scoring, it's now in the House rules. I worked for years to get it in the House rules. They actually expanded it in this Congress and said any major tax bill at a certain threshold will be dynamically scored. So I think it's pretty much accepted. I think what you're trying to see now is some people say, well, okay, and what we do is score things over a 10-year period. And I think what you're going to see is some say, well, what's it mean in 20 years? Well, the ability to predict 20 years out is just really impossible to do. And frankly, these predictions after about 3 years are very, very, as my kids would say, sketchy. So I do think that the concept of dynamic scoring is not a partisan issue. Hopefully it won't become one, because we do need this sort of real world, even if it is an estimate, what do we really think is going to happen to investment and jobs if we do these things on tax policy? The first bill to ever be dynamically scored was the Senate immigration bill. So, there was another opportunity, but that was the first major tax bill to do that. Again, thanks so much for having me here. Really appreciate it. Good luck. Yeah, thanks. Thanks.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we've been enjoying a Friday forum with Dave Kemp, former chairman of the United States Committee on Ways and Means and current senior policy advisor in PwC's Washington National Tax Services practice. Today's forum is the Bolton Memorial Forum on National Politics, made possible by a special gift from the Payne Fund in memory of Congressman Chester C. Bolton, Congresswoman Frances P. Bolton, and Congressman Oliver P. Bolton. We are very grateful for your support. Today's forum is sponsored by a generous gift from KeyBank. We thank KeyBank for your continued support. Our hospitality partner for today's forum is the Metropolitan at the 9 Hotel. Additionally, we welcome guests at tables hosted by the Cleveland Clinic and PwC. We thank everyone for your support and partnership. That brings today's forum to an end. Thank you very much, Mr. Camp. You were very informative and very balanced, I will say, also in your approach. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your participation. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.